Okay, so now that we've sort of got the introduction out of the way, let's look at sort of the first case example of merchant capital beyond Europe. And first, I think what we'll look at is China. We'll start with sort of the Sung dynasty, which existed between 960 and 1279 Common Era, or AD, depending on how you want to look at it. And then from there, we will go and look at the Ming dynasty. The Ming dynasty arguably was one of the most intensely commercial places in the world at the time. The trade in the Yangtze River Delta specifically, in many ways, dwarfed the trade in Europe as a whole. And so it raises an interesting question then of why, if it was such a sort of intensely commercial society, why it doesn't make that transition. And I think what's interesting about it is it sort of speaks against this kind of quantitative explanation that if you just get a larger and larger expansion of trade, and initially that happens. But as we'll see in both the cases of China and the Islamic empires, you are getting a constant expansion of trade. But you don't see that transition, at least for merchants that are engaged in trade, and even in some cases artisans in small-scale production, that they don't get into this sort of larger market-oriented production. Merchants are not investing in production in these two specific areas. So if we look at first the Sung dynasty, which I won't spend that much time on, the Ming dynasty is sort of the key focus here. There were exports, of course, as the slide here says. There was porcelain, there was paper, silk, tea, metals. Tea, of course, is something that European traders, especially the British, were insatiable for by the 19th century, which is largely what leads to the Opium Wars, which we'll mention much later in the course, but it's just something to think about as we sort of start looking at the role of merchant capital in the transition to capitalism. Now, what the Sung dynasty often imported were horses, spices, medicines, precious stones, cotton fabrics, and some of these things were imported from India, from Southeast Asia, but in many cases as far away as Europe. So you get the emergence of sort of a strong merchant capital base in China even before we get to the Ming period, which we're going to look at in a minute. If we just go to the next slide here, let's look at what eventually will become, well, before we get to the Ming, we have to look at the Mongols a little bit, which we talked quite a bit about last class and their role in, spreading this sort of large trading network. Now, what's really interesting in the case of China is that unlike Europe, you have this sort of central state structure that has existed for millennia. In Europe, of course, there was a central state structure that existed in what we call the classical period. It was, of course, the Roman Empire. And what you get in the the middle of the first millennium, around 400 at least in the West, is a complete collapse of the Roman Empire, which, as we saw, leads to the sort of political fragmentation of Europe and the emergence of feudalism as a sort of key state formation and mode of production, of course, until the transition to capitalism. Now, what made China so successful in its longevity, or at least this sort of unified political structure, was its specific state formation. The dynasties may have constantly changed, but that state structure has largely remained intact for about 2,000 plus years. Often when new dynasties moved in, whether it was the Sung or even foreigners in the case of the Mongols, or much later the Manchus of sort of the Northeast, and of course our focus today, sort of Ming China, 1368 to 1644, was the emergence of what was a very sophisticated and centralized imperial bureaucracy, something that didn't really exist in Europe. You had elements of this probably in the Roman Empire, but you don't really get it in feudal Europe. Most of what feudal Europe was rural. The power was based in the countryside. Right? And this sort of state structure allowed China to exist politically unified for a number of years. We're talking 2 millennia in this case. So let's look at Ming China specifically. Now, there are sort of embedded capitalist features that exist here, even if we don't have a capitalist mode of production. It is not exactly a feudal mode of production. You get more feudalism in Japan, which we will look at in a couple of weeks when we look at sort of capitalist revolutions. But what makes Ming China so fascinating is that it was an incredibly dynamic commercial society. And as I said earlier, it was mostly centered on that sort of Yangtze River trading system. And in many ways, that trading system was larger and more intense than all of Europe combined. And it was striking in its complexity of its internal trade. And what is also interesting, it was this large internal trade that existed. Of course, Ming China traded with outside commercial centers and powers. Of course, there was sort of these large armadas that sailed the Indian Ocean all the way to the east coast of Africa, ships that dwarfed, almost laughably dwarfed, the sort of European ships at the time that would come a couple hundred years later. In the case of Columbus, the Nina Maria and the Santa Maria were tiny by comparison. And in many ways, when you look at China, you're really comparing it in terms of scale to all of Europe, even in this period. Of course, we will compare it with different sections of Europe, but as a society, you really have to think of it in terms of all of Europe, not just France or England or northern Italy. Now, this commercial network of trade was so intense that some historians make the argument that if you went back in time and you looked at Ming China, and somebody asked you, well, where do you think you're going to get this expansion of what will become industrial capitalism? Most people would have bet on Ming China, not Europe. Europe, for most of its history, at least up until the emergence of capitalism, was underdeveloped, at least after the fall of the Roman Empire. It was kind of a backwater. It wasn't an economically dynamic place in the same way that China, India, and the Islamic empires were. And again, largely a rural space, of course, with the exception of the Italian city-states. Now, the question then becomes, if Ming China was a much more dynamically commercial society, even a specific region of Ming China, why didn't this commercial society transition to a capitalist mode of production in the same way that England does? Or the same way that the sort of merchants of Lynn, Massachusetts were able to take control of the artisanal system of production, which we're going to talk about later in the course. Now, the key to this, and one of the main reasons why this doesn't happen, is interesting. Part of what makes China so successful in terms of its longevity and sort of this sort of political unity that exists in comparison with a very sort of politically fragmented Europe under feudalism. But even when Europe makes that transition to capitalism, it's still largely politically fragmented, right? You have nation states. Modern Europe, of course, is attempting integration, and the European Union has its ups and downs, but for the most part is still centered around these sovereign nation states. But in China, of course, you had a more unified state system. So part of the reason merchant capital in China is not able to make that jump from trade to production, whether internal or external trade, had to do with a specific state formation. What made China's state formation successful in its longevity, in many ways, blocked the emergence of a kind of commercial capitalist mode of production. You had a very strong central state, whether it was controlled by the Mongols between 1279 and 1368, or Ming China between 1368 and 1644. That imperial bureaucracy remained largely intact, and of course stayed largely the same from one dynasty to the next. And it was this sort of powerful bureaucracy and powerful central government that limited the growth of what we would call private wealth, but specifically private wealth that was disconnected from the central government. So what's key here then is the imperial state's relationship with private property, and also the principal route by which a person living in that society could acquire and own great wealth. Indeed, there was a landed aristocracy, but truly great wealth was acquired through holding office in the imperial bureaucracy. The key was tax collectors and administrators to sort of local, regional areas of what is often referred to as the empire, although it doesn't operate in the same way that a lot of the European empires operated in. And what's key here is that imperial officials and administrators were actually prohibited from owning property in the regions they administered. And this was to prevent the emergence of wealthy and powerful regional centers that could challenge the central government. And in many ways, the central government was right to worry. As we saw in feudal Europe, often what happens was monarchies could be overthrown if you got a combination of powerful landed feudal lords A lot of the power was not in the central government, even if in theory these European states looked like they had a central government. But in China, the state structure was such that it prevented this sort of massive acquiring of wealth in sort of these regional power centers. Now, part of the way that these sort of regional administrators and tax collectors would acquire great wealth was they would simply take their cut of collecting taxes. And you got to remember, collecting taxes at this time was a lot more difficult than collecting taxes now, right? For those of you that have filed income tax, you look at your earnings, you look at what you have as tax credits, how much taxes you're going to pay, you file it with the Canadian government, and then in a few weeks, months, you eventually get a tax return saying whether you owe taxes or whether you get a tax credit or return. Which is happening obviously right now. And the way that taxes are taken off your wages, of course, is done by the company that you work for. But in China in this time, and in other societies, even in Europe and the Islamic empires, the way you collected taxes was somebody had to literally go out into the countryside and collect taxes. It was a difficult job. And part of the way that these people were paid was they would simply take a percentage of the taxes. So the wealth that was acquired by these administrators and tax collectors only worked if they commanded the allegiance of the imperial government. They could not acquire wealth independent of the imperial government. So what does this mean? First, it meant that the landed classes or the owners of property did not have much of a role in governing, and therefore could not secure private property rights in the same way that England's landed classes could. Additionally, the landed classes existed outside the state revenue raising system. Again, the tax collector comes from the central government. If we look back to feudal Europe, the way that revenue was raised, whether it be in the form of taxes or the agricultural surplus, it had to be mediated through local lords. And then those local lords would then pay their share to the government. And again, these local lords were not only just powerful, but also controlled their own militaries in terms of knights. So the taxes and value from the peasant-occupied land in Europe went through local landlords. In China, it was collected by imperial officials directly, rather than that transfer of surplus agriculture to a local lord, who then kicked up revenue to the central government. The imperial official then built his wealth by taking a cut of the taxes collected, not in the acquisition of property, even if it would have been legal for the imperial official to acquire vast sums of property. Second, this meant that even though peasants in China lived under oppressive conditions, just like they did everywhere, the imperial state had a good reason to preserve the peasantry and its possession of land, unlike what you get in England, which is the dispossession of peasants that eventually leads to the rise of commercial agriculture. In Ming China, the central government or the imperial government had a vested interest in maintaining the peasants and their occupation of the land, because that was a lot of where that tax revenue came from. So commercial agriculture along the English lines did not emerge because of the persistence of the peasantry. They were not dispossessed to make way for tenant farmers, which meant there was no incentive to create efficiencies that would sort of free surplus labor to move into other forms of employment. Even though you had a large population in China to produce things, that also meant you had a large population to consume things, right? So it never really got out of that sort of subsistence trap that existed in Europe and everywhere. It also meant a large segments of society could still live on subsistence and were not compelled to buy commodities or operate under sort of market forces. Nor was there a large labor market that could leave the land, because the state had an incentive, again, to keep peasants on the land. You didn't get that sort of movement of mass amounts of peasants into the central cities. Now, of course, much later in China's history, in the 20th century, that is exactly what you get under different processes, but you get the millions of people move from the countryside into more industrial jobs in large cities. And of course, in Europe, this started in the 14th, 15th, and 16th century. Now, in this sense, Imperial China probably had more in common with absolutist France than it did with England. Again, even though we're comparing them one society to another, Europe to China, what China looked like, even though it was more dynamically commercial than France, the relationship between the government and the land looked more like, say, Louis XIV to the peasantry at that point, largely because that's where most of the state revenue came from. So as a result, merchant capital in China lacked both that sort of surplus supply of labor to make the transition to more capitalistic practices. And when this, combined with the state's effort to suppress the acquisition of private wealth in both the landed and merchant classes, it just never got off the ground. There was no incentive for merchants then to reinvest in production because it lacked all the elements that were necessary in order to get that sustained capitalist takeoff. Chinese merchants could not take control of production, and even if they did, probably would have been blocked, and often were, by the imperial government. Because if they had, it would have created a kind of sort of regional power center with a large sort of wealth base that potentially could challenge the central government. And this is often, like I said, what we see in feudal societies. You see it in England, you see it in France, and you will eventually see it in Japan when we look at the capitalist revolution there. Now, this wasn't so much a trading empire, even though merchants exists. There were spurts where this happened, of course, when we looked at sort of the large treasure fleets that went from China into Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean. And part of it was that China was so large, it had all these elements, these sort of prefigurative elements that would eventually become central when it makes that sort of transition to capitalism. But at the time, because you don't get the rise of commercial agriculture for reasons that we looked at, largely because of the state limiting the growth of commerce, it just never makes that transition, right? So even though merchant capital in China was probably more intensely commercial than it was in Europe, because of that lack of transition on the countryside, you don't get the transition to a capitalist mode of production. Okay, so I think we'll cut it off there, and then in the next video we will look at merchant capital beyond Europe, specifically the Arabian and Muslim empires.